Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on street food taste in urban spaces with Professor Krishnendu Ray on doing sociology. To very quickly introduce our speaker, he's a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. He was the chair of the department from 2012 to 2021. He's the author of several books, including The Migrant Stable, The Ethnic Restaurateur, and the co-editor of Curried Cultures, Globalisation, Food and South Asia, and Practising Food Studies. He was a faculty member and the acting associate dean of liberal arts at the Culinary Institute of America and the president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society from 2014 to 18. He is an editor of the food studies journal Gastronomica, and his most recent work is available as co-edited special issues, one on street food in food culture and society, and another on food in the Indian Ocean world, mobility, materiality, and cultural exchange in Global Asia's initiative. Professor Ray, thank you so much for doing this and welcome to Doing Sociology.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So let me begin by asking you about how one can look at the role of street food vendors in cities like New Delhi and New York, and how can we understand markets and urban spaces?
A couple of things. The first thing to note is wherever there are markets, there are migrants, almost anywhere in the world, and most probably through most of human history. So there is a kind of a strong relationship between moving things, including food, and moving people. And the migrants can be transnational, as in the case today in New York City. To give you a sense, in New York City, there are about 25,000 street vendors, and 25,000 compared to a population of 8 million residents in the city, in the metro area, about 12 million. So the first thing you see that is similar in any large city in the world, be it New Delhi or be it New York, is people moving, migrants moving. In New York City, one of the dimensions of it is transnational migration. In New Delhi, for instance, the estimates range from 400,000 to 600,000 street vendors, according to Vigo and Jan Pahel. And remember, that's in relationship to what? New Delhi has a population of about 33 million. So there is a certain kind of similarity, and both are have some relationship to informality, which is also in some relationship to the formal labor market. So, and this in this, New Delhi and New York probably are mirror images of each other. They're inverse images of each other. In New York, most jobs are formal, have Social Security attached to it, etc. While in New Delhi, like in most parts of India, most jobs are in fact informal. So it's almost like the reverse 80-20 divide. So the similarity, though, both in New York and New Delhi, is most of the street vending happens in the partially shadow economy. We are working, in fact, next week. There is legislation in front of the city council to increase the number of street vendor licenses and permits, which is now at around 5,000. Ideally, we would love to see the expansion of it over the next few years. In contrast, for instance, India has a very progressive legislation, the Protection of the Street Vendor Livelihood Act of 2014. The implementation has been slow, the counting has been slow. So they are in some ways similar positioning in relationship to formality, which is, of course, a relationship to the state. Excuse me. And then a relationship to the question of what kind of privileges it comes with and what kinds of liabilities it comes with. Maybe the last thing I would point to maybe two other things. One is underlining something we have already talked about, which is this question of migration. Almost anywhere in the world, if you go to a city, say like Bangkok or Hanoi, you will see in some ways this relationship between the spread of capitalism in the countryside and an increasing surge in migration. So, in some ways, street vendors almost everywhere in the world are a symptom of a depeasantization of the society at the peak of it. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it towards the end of this conversation, because I think you had some questions about it. The other thing, the last thing I would mention here is street vendors, both in New York City and New Delhi, raise questions about what is private property, private space, what is public space, what is the right use and the proper use of a regulated public space, and of course the question of commons in different ways. So in both these cities, the challenges are how to regulate an important part of the livelihood of poor people who are using public spaces as a source of their livelihood. And so that's the question always of city and city regulation.
Can we connect street food with the pleasure of, or the pleasure of street food with vernacular taste?
Yeah, so in some ways, for me, my understanding of taste almost anywhere in the world is linked to regionality, which is linked to vernacularity, especially the dialect. In some ways, I would say wherever there's a dialect, there's a cuisine, because it's a twofold relationship. A dialect represents kind of a density of social relationship and ecological relationship. And if you think about India, and in some ways, I think there's a kind of a Hindustani saying, "Kose kose par pani badle chare kose par pani." Okay, which is in pani is a metonym for taste in the South Asian context. So kosa kosa is in some ways a metaphoric a mile or 2 miles. So, in some ways, language is always related in some ways to taste. And of course, think about it, our tongue plays a role in both in literal taste and also in terms of language. And if you think about food, food is very subjective. What you eat and what it tastes to you, and what something, say, shukti tastes to me, may or may not be similar. We find out only by talking to each other. In talking to each other, it socializes. That's why sociologists, that's why anthropologists talk about the social dimension of food, not so much what food tastes to you individually, but in some ways what food is about in terms of our collective judgment about good taste, bad taste, interesting, exciting stuff, etc. So everywhere, kind of every dialect is linked to a kind of a sensibility about taste. And the most interesting thing about food is that kind of regionality, locality of it. Or the obverse argument I could make is I find the taste of nationalism almost anywhere as kind of analogous to bad taste, be it American. If you think about what people in the world, what people in the United States think about American taste without its regionality, you will often end up with corporate foods like Pizza Hut, like McDonald's, which is kind of a version of corporate, I would say, a corporate idiom of nationalism. The real interesting food in the United States continues to be regional, the various stews, various fish stews, various pies, and of course, in various regions, like in southwest of the United States, you will have a lot more chilies in the food than you would have in the Northeast. In India, of course, that is kind of, you can multiply it across what? According to the Indian census, what, there are 125 major languages, mother tongues. There are what, 22,000 dialects, and you see that proximity between vernacularity of food and taste and talk. That I think is the most interesting thing in terms of a unit of analysis and its relationship to other regions, other people. And my first point, and remember our conversation on the previous point, which is, of course, people moving between these various regions and how food is changing, taste is changing. In the Indian case, almost 500 million people who have moved from their place of residence. And most of us, I mean, I was born in Shiliguri, raised in Kotak. My grandparents were in Balasore, lived in Jamshedpur, lived in Kolkata, lived in Benares, ended up in Delhi, okay, for college. And that is a characteristic both of working class populations and professional populations as they move. And this mobility is a mobility across vernaculars and dialects, leading to very interesting kind of a relationship between this kind of mobility and the groundedness of vernacular taste. And I'll give you one last example. When I ate, say, what would be called puchka, golgappa, pani puri from Shiliguri to Cuttack to Kolkata to Benares, in some ways the names changed, the taste changed. More mango, in some places would have more a dried mango powder in it. Some places would have more tamarind in it. Some places would be sweeter, and some places more sour, spicier. So you can see even in a thing that bridges kind of regions, like say pani puri, puchka, golgappa, you will see the changing patterns of it depending on where it is being consumed and by whom. So I think this relationship between vernacularity and taste, both aspects of it, the taste part and the talk part, is absolutely kind of a dynamic element of sociological analysis of food.
That's very, very interesting. And in fact, I am myself very, very interested in, further pursuing it. So thank you so much. Uh, what would be some of the best ways to think about, let's say, materiality and sociability without really falling into this trap of thinking about pleasure as apolitical?
Excellent question. I think one of it is to pay attention to the materiality. If you're going to describe a chart, use the local language, use the kind of a local inflection without imposing what things look like from Delhi or Mumbai or Kolkata. Okay, so if you are in Agartala, kind of look at it from that local perspective. And so that is kind of one dimension of it, to avoid the imperial view, which can be global imperial or which can be national imperial. I think which is kind of in India. We are really aided by the fact that so many languages survive and are robust and used in an everyday way. So use the local language to connect it to translocal languages, depending in whatever language you're going to write. So kind of one dimension is pay attention to the thing itself, in this case the food, and the language used to describe it, describe taste, because remember, that's the thing that socializes food. Otherwise we don't exactly know what something tastes like inside your mouth and inside mine. So that's one dimension of it. The second dimension of it is, and this is also not only with street food, but with home cooking. And for me, that was the impulse towards my eventual work on food, is I had done progressive politics, but and I had been fed for almost 25 years, and I had never paid attention to the people who were cooking, cleaning, and feeding me, mostly women. And only after I came to the United States, that's why I often tell my friend I'm a bit of a reverse anthropologist. When I came to the United States, or almost like a reverse a sociologist, a cultural sociologist. When I came to the United States, it just struck me that what had I had taken for granted, 3 meals of a day, cooking, cleaning, etc., that I had not paid attention to this quotidian aspect of it. To pay attention to the quotidian aspect is to pay attention to labor. And the labor that may be paid, or the that may be the labor of love, which is often gendered in a very particular way. So I think what allows one the capacity to take pleasure in food without being in some ways turning it into just an apolitical gourmandise is to pay attention to labor. Pay attention to the conditions of labor. Pay attention to who is doing the work, under what conditions. And in some way, in this case, for instance, you take home cooking, street food, restaurant food, high-end food. Someone has to work it. And what are the conditions of work and what are the limitations of work? In, for instance, in work on street vending, one of the challenges is access to portable water. If you can provide access to portable clean water, that will really make both the lives of street vendors much better and the lives of consumers much safer, food safety. And that is linked to, for instance, access to bathrooms. So in some ways, you cannot think about street vending, street food, or any food without talking about labor and infrastructure. And I think those two things, attention to labor and infrastructure, would very clearly enable us to pay attention to questions linked to good taste, but not limited to kind of just a kind of an arrogant gourmand's attitude towards it.
Right. Thank you. So, can transactions around literal tastes basically provide a window to think about power and urban cultures? I know that you've worked on South Asian restaurateurs in New York City, and if you could use some examples from your own work to talk about it.
Yeah, that's at the heart of my work, The Ethnic Restaurateur, which was the argument is that the idea of good taste, and especially taste with cultural capital, in Pierre Bourdieu's analysis of distinction, for instance, is associated with certain kinds of good taste. To give you an example, New York City historically, French food, and then Italian food. First, it was French food, was considered high-end food. You can charge a lot more, 3 to 4 times more for if you're calling a restaurant French restaurant, if you're cooking by French techniques, if you're using ingredients that are often used in French cuisine, and if you're using French on your menu, and you have a wine list that is French and mostly European and Italian. Compared to what? Compared to, for instance, restaurants in New York City, Chinese restaurants almost as old as French restaurants. But in Chinese restaurant, you could never charge the kind of price you would charge in a French restaurant. And there was a small section there where elites would go to try out fashionable things. For instance, in the 1920s, which is chop suey became very fashionable. But most Chinese restaurants continue to be, in some ways, relatively cheap food, which is often called ethnic food within quotation mark. So it's food, especially restaurant food, street foods, are a fantastic way of analyzing social hierarchy, which is an important question for sociologists. And if you look at today, I have looked at material from Yelp and Zagat and Michelin. You clearly see, for instance, the latest Michelin, about 2 to 6% of Indian, Chinese, and Mexican restaurants are high-end restaurants, okay? Compared to, for instance, French or subsequently Italian. By the way, Italian used to be poor people's restaurant because it was linked to immigrants' food, in this case, Italian immigrants, who came in the largest number in the 1880s to 1920s. It took almost 50 more years, 1970s, with the end of migration of poor Italians and the upward mobility of Italians and the whitening of Italians, where Italians became white people culturally. They didn't change their color, but their social significance of their color changed. As that happened, Italian food became high end, where almost 20 to 25% of restaurants in New York City, Italian restaurants in New York City would be high end. And this is, as I said, compared to Mexican food, is a terrific example. In the United States today, Mexicans, people of Mexican heritage, kind of hover around 35 million to 40 million people, which is one of the largest groups. But that is quite comparable to Irish immigrants before about 100 years ago, and Italian immigrants are about 15 million. German immigrants, by the way, about the same number, about 40 million as English immigrants. And you see these differences in Mexican food about depending on what data set you're looking at. Yelp or Zagat or Michelin, 2 to 6% are high-end restaurants. Most are basically either street food or kind of working class eateries and to the mid-market range. So in some ways, understanding um, uh, uh, taste in this urban context of New York City, it kind of reveals much about sociological questions, about hierarchy, about class, about race, and also, by the way, about gender, who works. In many of these public restaurants and eateries, the people who sell food are often men, though people who make food at home continue to be women almost everywhere in the world. So you see this kind of absolutely fascinating way of thinking about good taste and social hierarchy, about which we have a lot of literature on music. Who's listening to what kind of music? Think about Pierre Bourdieu's work in Distinction. Music is a big example of it. We know a lot about architecture, housing, and hierarchy. In some ways, the work on food and hierarchy and social group is relatively recent, and that's surprising because the evidence is almost everywhere. And maybe that's the reason we have not systematically talked about it historically, because it's almost quotidian everywhere around us, which of course makes it very exciting for a sociologist to study this because it's all around us and people have very strong opinions about what is good, what is bad, and you can bring it together. Like I was reading um, preparing myself for my next class. And I was reading Stories from the Heart by Dolly Kikon and Joel Rodriguez, Food Journeys, which is partly linked to food in the Northeast. And that, again, I saw this kind of a reflection of hierarchy of taste between, say, Naga food or food from Tripura in Tripura or in Agartala or in, say, New Delhi, what happens, and this whole question of mobility, ethnicity, and hierarchy.
Right. So, continuing this discussion, how does one think about ethnic food in cosmopolitan cities like New York? Or, I mean, is there something called ethnic food? I know that you have also, dwelled into this. So, if you could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, let me finish one point from the previous question that I forgot, which is very interesting. What has happened since the 1970s is, for instance, Japanese cuisine has become joined the rank of elite cuisines. The most expensive restaurants in New York City are Japanese. Korean food is kind of beginning to play a similar role. So it's not just kind of you see similarity, but you also see change over time. That my argument that is linked to the rise of Japan and especially East Asia, and specifically I think about it as an aftertaste of empire, of the American empire. It is not coincidental that the Americans were in Japan, in Korea, in substantial numbers as military, and it's linked back to both American taste, but there's also a global dimension of it. Now, coming back to your question on food and ethnicity, the word ethnic comes from the Greek ethnos, means people. So any people can be defined as, in some ways, ethnic, but historically, what has happened in the American context, and it became a global phenomena, largely ethnic food has been identified as the food of the other. And if to think about what is the food of the other, you have to think about what is the normative center. In the American case, it was largely Anglophone white food that was at the heart of the idea of our food, American food, when they say as American as apple pie. Okay. And every other food, so Chinese food becomes ethnic, Indian food becomes ethnic. So this relationship between the center and the margin developed mostly in the journalistic literature and then in the scholarly literature from about 1950s, kind of middle 50s, to into it peaked by about 1980s, 1990s. And then by about 2010, major American newspapers like, say, the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, that I have looked very closely, slowly stopped using the word ethnic for other people's food. They would name it. They would call it Korean. They'll call it Japanese. They'll call it Indian. And in fact, subsequently, they'll also make it regionalize it, which is probably even better, like not just Mexican food, but Poblano, Oaxacan food. Just like Indian food is an abstraction, it's probably better to call it, say, food from Tamil Nadu, food from Kerala, food from Karnataka, food from New Delhi, etc. So that happened. So if you think about it, 1950s to about 2010 was the heyday of this conception of ethnic food that was built around the assumption of what is the mainstream and what is the side stream. The mainstream was considered if you're a German, if you're English, if you're Irish, if you're even Italian, you would have become mainstream. But there was also regional characteristic in part of the American South, say in New Orleans. For the longest time, deep into the 21st century, Italian food was still considered ethnic food. So food in practice, it marked the food of the other, especially in my analysis, food of the immigrant poor was often seen as ethnic food. And I think that category of ethnic got universalized at one point of time. So when you have chicken tikka masala in Delhi, it may or may not be ethnic at all, or butter chicken, okay? But if you have Naga food in Delhi or Assamese food in Delhi, and that in some ways has the mark of ethnicity. So ethnicity, the idea of ethnicity is a universal notion of ethnos, the people, but in practice, it has largely been used to identify the side stream around a mainstream. Okay, and so too in American history. And my last point on that, in the American conception of ethnicity, there's a sense that it is the food of the poor working class because other people's food, even rich people's food, are not considered ethnic. For instance, French was never considered ethnic. French was considered other people's food, but the food of the elites of Europe. In some ways, that has also happened now with Italian food, as almost 20 to 25% of Italian restaurants in New York City have become upscale. So in some ways, this category called ethnic food has a history, is born, comes into play, and dies like anything. In that sense, I think sociological insight is very useful to mark that kind of the trajectory from birth, usage, how is it used, and then its slow demise. It's just happening. It has happened in the big American markets. The large American newspapers are no longer using the category called ethnic food. And I think partly my own work in the ethnic restaurateur has something to do with it, and the argument about it. And now it is in some ways gotten much more, the categories have become national and subnational as a new way of classifying taste in the city.
Right. Last question. How can we study food? I mean, what are some of the tools and methods that can be used to locate food in a sociological context?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about it. I use a range of methods, including, and if your audience, as they're exposed to sociology, would know there is kind of a very substantial quantification. You can do quantitative analysis, which is very good for wide and representative claims. So if you think about labor force participation rates, who stays home, who goes out to work, and what is its relationship to cooking and feeding. If you think about hunger, if you think about nutrition in terms of population level, say India's, say 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion people, large quantitative studies, often with sophisticated statistical analysis, allow you a picture, a wide picture, a representative picture, but usually a thin picture. So it's good for certain things. Each method is good for certain things and not for other things. Then you have what is often called qualitative sociology, which are small n studies, which are much deeper, which are closer to what anthropologists call ethnographic work, participant observation work, in this close quarter of understanding, in some ways, complexity, density. So in my ethnic restaurateur, I use larger numbers to talk about number of restaurants, etc. But I use close quarter analysis to look at what does taste look like, say, from the point of view of the immigrant restaurateur compared to the customer. Okay, so we have a lot of information about the customer. So I couldn't get that information until I embedded myself, in this case, about 30 restaurateurs in New York City, and spent time with them, spent days with them, cooked with them, and talked to them at home, at work, to develop that kind of a depth, what Clifford Gates called deep hanging out. Okay. And this was this deep hanging out that gives you a sense of an immigrant, in my case, the immigrant notion of the taste of Americans. So, like, say, with Muhammad Rasul, I asked him, hey, why don't you call your restaurant Indian food? And by Indian food, you are from Pakistan. Why don't you call it Pakistani food? He says, yeah, Americans, they don't know the difference between these places. If I call it Pakistan, they'll think it's Afghanistan. American, he laughs. American geography is very poor, so they cannot make these distinctions. So I take a safe bet. Most people are a little more familiar with this place called India. So I sell Indian food. And of course, Indian Punjabi food and Pakistani Punjabi food are very similar. Food in Lahore and food in Delhi are similar. So it led to a very deep conversation that would not happen if you just took a survey from far away. So depending on what you want to do, how representative work you want to do, or how depth work you want to do, the techniques, the methodologies are important. And I'll then give two subsets of, if you're doing quantitative work, measurement is very important. If you're doing qualitative work, metaphor making is very important. You have to make a metaphor. Okay. And metaphor making is often what we call theorization. And theorization is in some ways embeds your current work in a long lineage. Like, for instance, in my case, what is the relationship of my work to Pierre Bourdieu's work on distinction? Or say, let's end with where we started. We talk about street vendors. When I said, wherever there are a large number of street vendors in the city, it's a sign of depeasantization of society. I'm there intervening in a long debate about capitalism, agriculture, urbanization. So there you see, in some ways, you see measurement, metaphor making with qualitative work, and with quantitative work, the other side of it. So I hope that kind of illustrates a little bit in terms of methods.
Yes, it does. And thank you so much. This has been such a wonderfully engaging conversation. And I hope that our viewers and listeners go through it and then also look at your works and take an interest in the sociology of food and food studies. Thank you once again for doing this, for doing sociology.
Hey, thanks a lot. Take care.
Yeah, you too.